Welcome back to the show. I'm so excited for my conversation with my guest today. So Timothy, would love to have you start off by telling us who you are and what you do in the events industry.
Yeah, my name is Timothy Calder. I am a director of global events at Achievers. We're an employee recognition company, so that's a way to make sure that your employees feel seen and heard and that their work is acknowledged. I've been here for 8 years. As the director, I'm responsible for all of our trade shows, our field marketing, our webinar marketing, as well as our customer marketing.
Amazing. And I'm really excited for our conversation today because your, under your portfolio is webinars. And I know, when we were talking about things we could talk about, we were talking about how webinars kind of gets thrown around. Like sometimes it lives under demand gen, sometimes it lives under events, sometimes it lives with none of those people, right? It is kind of the thing that everyone knows they should be doing. They don't usually have a great plan on how they should be doing it, and not really a strong strategy on how they go from the webinars to conversion. So excited to kind of talk about that path since you do still own, that end-to-end experience. So tell me, when you're thinking out your event strategy and webinar strategy, is your goal to get people to webinars first? Is the webinar used after the event? Is it a mix of both? Like, what is your thought process when you're building that out?
So as we're planning out our webinar strategy, there is alignment with our event strategy where if there's key messages that we want to deliver, that's typically aligned to a message that we want to deliver at a trade show or a field event. So as I'm working with my content team, aligning on what decks we're going to be using, what customers we may be inviting for those experiences. But in terms of conversion and the funnel, we do operate them as parallel channels. Our webinar program, we target in two ways. One, there's a long-term play for brand of we're generating audiences is that we don't necessarily think will convert over to sales, but we want them to know the name Achievers. We want them to know what they do because we believe that in 2 or 3 years, they might be in a more better position to convert into an opportunity when they get promoted or when they leave to a new company. But then there's the angle of converting over to sales to generate new pipeline and opportunities. So we're balancing those two needs. One of the things that we've built into our program is for our trade show sponsorships, we're very active trying to get as many leads and scans as we can. And I actually am an advocate of scanning everybody. And I know that's a point of contention within the trade show community. But the reason why I do that is we have a very strong lead scoring system to make sure that only those that are really in the buying cycle go over to sales from the trade show. But we bring along those trade show scans to the webinar journey. And we see conversion over 3 and 6 months. And we also see improved conversion the next year at the same trade show because we've been nurturing that audience with content about our brand, about our new products, about our proprietary research throughout the course of a year. So there's alignment between those two programs where we know that they benefit one another. And because they're under the same portfolio, we can build the analytics and reportings to be able to show that to the business.
Yeah, and I think that most people are anti scan everybody because they don't have the right follow up in place. Like if you have a perfect lead scoring or a next to perfect lead scoring, you aren't actually wasting your time because all of it, like you said, is going to be funneled correctly. And like the people that are afraid to scan everybody is because then they have a BDR manually calling all of those people with no actual insight on them. And so it probably is a waste of time to scan all those leads, right? But it's that pre-work that you have to do and get that really strong with your marketing ops, your rev ops, or whoever to make it worthwhile.
You have to have that real title relationship. And, me and my CMO disagree on that strategy. And when we're working the same trade show booth, we're delivering a slightly different message occasionally, but it's a healthy conversation between us. But now, increasingly with the use of AI, we're starting to debate when is the appropriate time for a sales rep or a BDR to do the follow-up, or when is it artificial intelligence and a chatbot or an AI-driven email campaign that no longer requires the bandwidth of an AE or an SDR that costs the organization money, right, in terms of salary. And now we can actually decide, like, with the lead score and with the quality of the lead, which ones get followed up by a human and which ones potentially are followed up with in a non human format, but allows us to scale up and reach out to everyone. Because the challenge with webinar programs is you can get thousands of registrations to a program. We did an external sponsorship with a webinar that had 20,000 registrations and 10,000 viewers. And that month, our SDRs were, which ones do we work? Because there's so many of them that are in that qualified function, they just can't handle everything. And so you're always in the webinar program managing that capacity to surface exactly which ones you think are most engaged. There's various ways we do that beyond just the demographic scoring, but with the webinar platform, seeing whether or not they're doing survey answers with like written responses or questions, if they're engaging with the Q&A of the webinar platform, if they're hitting the like button on certain platforms to show that they were paying attention at certain moments. But you're dealing at such a scale and volume that, it's an imperfect system, and you really do. That's one of the reasons why I also like having the webinar and event portfolio under one portfolio, because we can forecast by week how many leads we expect to be generating across those programs and negotiate with the SDR team and the sales team how many, like making sure, one, they're staffed, making sure that, people aren't on PTO or it's not a week where there's a holiday or that type of thing, but also making sure that we're not overrunning them with leads and not running a webinar on the same week that we're running our, the biggest trade show that we need to get the most return on. And we're not isolated departments that aren't speaking to each other. It's under one banner. And so that's a really important factor for why it sits under my portfolio.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you're talking about the dates, not just from what do we have going on this week, but how are we forecasting everybody's time, right? Because we all know, yes, the weeks of holidays are going to have an impact. I bet from my experience, the first week of every quarter probably has less sales reps on in the office or on the phones, right? Because, that's just the cyclical nature of sales. So it is interesting that you're really defining, okay, that true follow-up of like, it's not just an afterthought, because I've seen so many times, and I know you and I have had conversations of the vanity metrics around, I mean, there's vanity metrics around all types of marketing, right? But around webinars of, oh my God, we got 1,000 people to sign up for this webinar, or we did a series and we had 1,000 people signed up for it. So we just keep signing them up for all the rest of them, but not actually taking into account, oh, well, next week is the biggest trade show of the year, or there's something else happening. I know I've also worked in seasonal industries where the seasons impact when people were available to sit on webinars. That, it was a very summer workload focused industry. So, January, February, great time for webinars. August, forget about it. Like, no one's around, right? So it is really important to tie those. And I think that so often people are like, well, we just have to get webinars on the calendar, and they get us so many leads. And again, if you don't have a follow-up strategy, then you just hundreds of or thousands of just cold leads sitting in your CRM.
Yeah, calendars are always a hot topic, and those seasonalities do have an impact. I always push back a little bit on it. Like, there's never a perfect time to have a corporate event. There are better times than others. There are a few dates within the course of a year that are blackout from both an in-person and a webinar date. But I kind of use the example of, this isn't your wedding. This isn't your family member not able to attend that you're going to hear about it for the next 50 years. These are pipeline generating activities. And, there are activities we've run in August that have been successful. Obviously, you lose an audience, and at the executive level, it's a little bit more challenging because, they're more likely to take a little bit longer vacation. But nobody in the B2B world is really taking 6-8 weeks vacation throughout the course of the year. Like, it's a little bit of a balance when I'm trying to find those dates for things that I push back a little. Understand, I'm not going to get everyone we would absolutely love, because I'm choosing a date that is less than potentially ideal, but we will secure an audience, and there are ways to do that. So, you have to balance it out. It's really monitoring when are the key periods that your internal people are unavailable. So There are dates that it's like, you need to be respectful of their time, their PTO, their well-being. And those are more where I'm really considering blackout dates of like, hey, our CEO will give us in the holidays, if we during the summer period, if we hit certain numbers, they'll give certain days off extra during the period of time. So I'll look at my calendar and make sure I'm not scheduling something that's going to require other people to do work so that they can achieve that corporate benefit.
Yeah. It's interesting because I worked at a company once where we did smaller events. We were more roadshow style, so kind of moving through the country. And for years they never did July and August. Like they're like, no one will come to an event in July and August. And then I'm like, well, what if we just tried? Because I'm running out of time in the rest of the year when you then take out a couple weeks at the holidays and whatever. And we had success because, like you said, there's never going to be a perfect time. And actually, we sometimes found that people were more willing to come to those events at that time because the office was a little quieter. They felt like they could get away for a couple of hours. Like it didn't feel so overwhelming as like their crunch time. But I think it's very interesting that you're planning more for your internal team than you are for the attendees. And most people are probably thinking about it the other way around, right? They're so focused on we have to get those people registered. It has to be the perfect time for them. But if it's not a perfect time for your team to execute on it, then it was a complete waste of time to have them there in the first place.
It was a lesson early on in my time at Achievers when a really good opportunity happened to be scheduled the same week as our revenue kickoff ceremony in February, and it's nobody can go, nobody can attend, and the people that you do attend get less value for the company over the course of the year because they couldn't attend RKO, and it impacted me every year since and even during that period of RKO now, I block out, like, I'm not going to do marketing in the week before and the week after, and like there's a 3-week period where I really truly try to avoid either scheduling a field event or a webinar because I know everyone's either focused on enablement or the outcomes or what have you.
Which is like people would call you a heretic. Like people would say, "What do you mean you don't like do those like selling is the priority?" But like you said, if those teams are not enabled because they had to skip out, and one of my like latest crusades is stop making your event staff who are part of your revenue organization run your rev kickoff. Like fine, they can be part of they can source the venue, they can choose the caterer if you want to either cut down on costs or they like doing it or whatever. But the number of times I've been on a revenue team where I've spent most of the event dealing with the caterers, dealing with an AV issue, dealing with a travel issue, right? Like let your people actually benefit from those activities, and they're probably going to be better sellers. And again, like I'm sure most people would be like, what do you mean you don't schedule over 3 weeks? And I can just hear like people I've worked with in the past like literally losing their minds over the thought of that. But it's actually beneficial, and you're setting your teams up for success, especially when you have successful programs that are not just based on vanity metrics, that actually warrant proper follow-ups to all of the leads, right?
Well, the things that don't show up on a dashboard are if you've scheduled an event or a webinar activity and you haven't had proper follow-up. When you look at that dashboard 2 months later, a year later with an executive, they just see the numbers of did it convert. They don't see the narrative of actually the leads got delivered late by the vendor. If it wasn't like a webinar that you hosted, we got it 2 days late. They were kind of cold when the sales team got it. It happened to be during a holiday period where 2 of our SDRs had left the organization and we were understaffed. Those narratives don't exist on explaining the context of why an event or a webinar may have not executed. So as a planner, I have to keep that in mind, that I need to make sure that I'm scheduling my programs so that they can perform regardless of what potentially that back end. And so the more that I can have alignment with those teams on how and when they're going to work those leads, the better my programs look on reporting.
Yeah. And I'd love to get your opinion on it's been a while, like I said, since I've owned a webinar program, but I used to do a lot of them. And I worked in an organization where we were really focused on very niche webinars. So our webinars actually didn't get a lot of attendees, but it was such a niche topic that it paid off for us because the people that were interested in it were the right people, were the right, like, engaged buyers, really signaled, okay, you're the right person to talk to in that organization. Where, I think, again, so many people are looking for the hundreds and thousands of leads, but do you have any, like, you know, experience or anything like that, doing like really, really niche ones where you're like, welcome everybody, and thinking there's literally only three people here, but it doesn't matter because the salespeople are happy because we finally got that person to engage with something, or we finally got into that organization we've been trying to get into. And no one else knows that there's only three people here, right? So, and this topic is so niche and boring that it's...
Oh, we've got that balance within our program. Like we have our monthly webinar that's more of our brand or top level, mid level webinar where we're looking to get hundreds or thousands of registrations in order to fill our database as well as to generate the MQLs. But we've got niche webinars. We've got a webinar happening in July, and we might only have 12 people on it, but it's really an like an ABM account play where we're trying to influence a number of different stakeholders with content within that account and ancillary partners within that sphere. We also, within my program, I still, since the pandemic, I've continued our virtual experiences for more narrow audiences. So we do wine tastings and chocolate tastings in those kind of formats where it's a combination of perhaps we have 20 guests on the experience. We'll do some form of experiential of getting an explanatory of like, here's some chocolates you get, here's the history of them, 10 minutes of content around that, a little bit of presentation about Achievers Thought Leadership, and then opening up that forum for discussion amongst the attendees. And, within our, with their relationship with our email marketing team, we sat down with my webinar team and my field marketing team and my trade show team, and we carved out audiences and personas and said, if you're in this function, in this size of company, we want your invitations to actually go to my field program as opposed to my webinar program, because we want those more high touch, intimate programs once you reach a certain job level or certain interest in our product versus the broad vanity metric. But I recall when I started when I took over responsibility for the webinar program 5 years ago, we had made a strategic decision that we had been sponsoring a lot of external webinars that generated large audiences, and it was a substantial portion of our budget. It was a few $100,000 in the course of a year. But the challenge that we saw with conversion with those webinars was we would get the leads late, and we would, they would like, takes 2 days to get the leads from the vendor, and then the marketing operations team at that time, they had an SLA of 48 hours on an activity. So it's like, now it's 4 days, and, hopefully it wasn't over the course of a weekend too, that it's now those leads are 5 days old. And so what I told the organization is we were going to build our own program using our software for handling the webinar that was integrated into our data system, and we could turn over those leads faster. And I believe that we could build a strong webinar program. The first time I ran a webinar, there was 35 attendees on the webinar. We were still learning how to use our email marketing database. We were learning how to promote our activity. And the thought leader at the time at the organization sent a note to my CMO that was that worth my time? Which is not the message that you want to receive from a leader, right? You want to make sure that they understand what you're trying to build. Now, I was able to persuade my CMO that we were on the right direction, that we had a strategy, and over time, that thought leader became a real champion of our program. But setting expectations at the outset of, we're not looking for 1,000 registrations on this webinar. We're looking for 25 of the right people, like I said, for that ABM play that we're doing, because that just sets expectations with the participants. Because if they come in and they're like, well, wait, the last thing we did a month ago had 3,000 registrations, and now I'm on something with 30. What did you do wrong? And that was never the goal. That was never the dynamic. So part of it is setting those expectations.
Yeah, I think that's really spot on. Of it's one thing, like it's hard to explain to people sometimes that aren't like behind the strategy or living it, that bigger is not always better, and like here's why, both for virtual and in person, right? I've had these conversations with people before of like, bigger is not better. Having a room of 200 people that are not your ICP is not as valuable as having a room of 12 people with your ICP, right? Like if they're not going to buy, they're not going to buy, right? And I think it's really, like you said, it can be challenging when they're not understanding what the strategy is. And also like the difference between the programming, like is the programming growth where you're just trying to get as many like people and names and titles and everything through the virtual door, versus that nurture of, kind of moving things along the sales cycle or getting really targeted to that like end conversion.
Yeah, that's setting that expectation of what the program for, what the goal is, and being able to report back is really important. And for us, it's being able to tell that narrative of how all of these programs interrelate. That a trade show sponsorship where you're expecting a certain number of meetings booked on site, and perhaps it turns out the way you want it to on site, but being able to show, well, we can expect we're still going to get more. And we have proof points in past data and past behavior that like they're going to continue to be nurtured. The investment of this trade show is going to continue to show impact for the next couple of months. I like having that all under one house rather than siloed departments where you're trying to like tap somebody on the shoulder going, remember that like some of those leads that you're claiming are yours were actually impacted by our journey in our program.
Right. And I'm also curious how you're building out, we talked a lot about follow up, but also using that content, right? Because we know that the internet is basically a content monster, right? Just always hungry. We're always feeding the beast. And I also just personally know like the number of times I've registered for a webinar that I didn't watch the replay, right? Like, so how are you balancing the value of the people that are there, the people that aren't there, and how are you making the most of that investment after the fact?
Yeah, so with our webinar content, we use the On24 platform. They have an AI tool called ACE. So when we're doing the follow-up email to the people who didn't watch our webinars, instead of giving them the full webinar, we're giving them the highlight clips from that webinar. Because if you didn't show up for the full hour-long episode, you're unlikely to watch the on-demand content. And we really don't push the on-demand content with our marketing. We make it SEO discoverable, but we don't really push additional marketing campaigns to it. But we create those clips, we share them with our customers so that they put it on social media. We share,
Sure.
if we've got a really great customer interview as part of that, we will share that over with our content team that would create and add flavor to a case study with quotes or clips from that webinar program. But one of the things that I really love about the alignment within our programs is with our annual user conference, we use it as a stage to produce a series of webinars that we call the Recognition Masterclass that we run every fall, which is content that we record on site during that conference while we have all of our customers gathered. So that series gets produced with a couple of the sessions from the main stage get recorded, and we'll air those as is as a Simulive experience for that Recognition Masterclass. We'll also use slide decks that were prepared and do a remix so that we get the highlights of what was delivered at the conference, so that we're reusing that work that was clipped. We've got a podcasting studio where we're capturing podcasts with our customer interviews during the conference, during the show. We have a person on the street type scenario where we have a camera going around the facility and we give them kind of see if you can get quotes about this product or this activation, sure, or this thing that we can then clip over, and we do highlight reels for our webinar program. And so they both kind of feed one another of content creation and making sure that you're making more use of the spend that you're making on some of those big activities, that you're going to reuse it in your webinar program. We've also done scenarios where we've sent cameras to our field events to capture the panel within the context of that field event, and then that becomes a Simulive or on-demand webinar. And we've worked with external partners to syndicate some of that content so that you want to maximize the use of anytime your customers give you time to talk about their success with your product. And so finding multiple ways and formats that you can distribute their time and contribution adds value to both them from a branding perspective, but also your own organization in terms of capturing leads.
Amazing. Yeah. So so many like great thoughts, because it's funny, and I'm sure you hear it all the time of like, virtual being dead, webinars being dead, like everything's dead, right? Like everything's dead. Right? But I think like what you've shown us today is that if you're actually building in the strategy, there is ways that it's paying off, and it can't just be the afterthought, or just can't be the like, oh, we just added it because we needed to get webinars on, or we needed the content, or we couldn't afford to do the event, right? Like, I think it's really framing webinars and virtual events as not the like stepchild or step sibling of live events. They're part of the ecosystem, the same way that social, the same way that email marketing and SEO and all of those things, like they deserve their own spot. It's just like, and I think like COVID made them more prominent, and then everyone was like so sick of being on Zoom, and so it's like finding their new place in the content and marketing ecosystem.
Yeah, for me, there's always the like everyone has Zoom fatigue, and I'm like, I still get my audiences. I'm sure you're tired, but I find other people. With webinar, what I'm pondering is what's the future of webinar in the age of podcasting, and what distinguishes the
Mm-hmm.
difference between what's a webinar and what's a podcast. It's always interesting.
I would love to know, because it's like, why do I need to do video for my podcast?
The only like the primary difference is right now, especially now that podcasts are very much a video format as much as they are an audio format. Like, what's the difference? And the difference is largely the ability to capture information with the form, because
Right.
the podcasting platforms, at least to my knowledge, don't typically give you the contact information of people who've watched your program, and that's the difference between a podcast and a webinar. So, at what point does a technologist solve that problem for B2B marketers? And I
Yeah.
think about Exit 5 and their podcast, and they always have the running joke of not calling their webinars webinars, and
Right.
then re-airing their webinars as podcasts because the mediums have blended. So
Yeah.
that's where in the last a couple of months our organization has launched a podcast with our thought leaders, and it's separate from our webinar program. And the question long term becomes, oh, right. Well, how do you merge those programs, or those customer speaker journeys? What's the difference? Can you find technology to capture data so that you can convert people that attend a podcast? And we know it does impact brand and reputation, and it drives subscribers, and it's a really valuable exercise. But it's a different. That's right now. It's only the difference of production is essentially the same. The only difference I can see is the form and the data.
Yeah. Yeah. And webinars in theory are live, right? Like you're getting the chat going, you're getting that, like, yes, people can comment on Spotify on an episode, but it's not it's more broadcasting than like webinar that, sometimes I know they're pre-recorded, but like that are live and have a chat going and live Q&A, whereas the podcast is kind of the after. But yeah, it is interesting to see how it's like a couple years ago no one would think to watch the podcast on YouTube. And it's funny, when I first started listening to podcasts like over 10 years ago, I was consuming them on YouTube, not because I was watching the video, but that was the easiest way to stream it at the time, is I would put it on my laptop and just have the YouTube running while I was doing other things. Whereas now, like, we've gone back to it, and I'm like, oh, why? Like, I'm listening to this while I'm driving, or I'm listening to this while I'm working or cleaning or whatever. So it is interesting, but I think that if you can figure out how to merge or cross them over, it does strengthen your brand, because it gives people another way to consume it on the go, consume it, and build that thought leadership of something that they might not sit down and watch for an hour, but will passively listen to at 1.8 times speed. But it doesn't matter. I'm just getting it
I
in
can only
there.
do 1.5. When I go above that, I can't keep track. But I mean, I'm a massive consumer of podcasts. Like,
Yeah.
I've done LinkedIn posts. I'm listening to them at the gym all the time, on the way to work, in my commute, all those types of things. They're an important medium for marketing to cover.
Yeah, and we're bringing them into our live events. And, like, we could do a whole other episode on podcasting and the events industry and how that's integrating into events. But thank you so much. This was so informative. I know, I followed you on LinkedIn for so long, and you're such a thought leader, and what you've done at Achievers is really, like, impressive. The way that you've built that program over the last few years is really great. So I really appreciate you coming on and taking the time.
Thank you for having me on.